During my time there, my entire outlook on life changed. I no longer feel anything positive about Russian statehood. This isn't a war, but some kind of agony. The only parallels that come to mind are with the First World War. You're simply being driven to the slaughter. These are the words from a former Russian soldier who spent time in a Storm Z unit fighting in Ukraine, who's recently deserted, fled to somewhere in Europe where he is currently seeking political asylum. He conducted an interview with a publication called Vertska that we're going to run through here. Vertska, in their own words, is a socio-political publication that explores and describes how society functions inside of Russia. Now, we're going to talk through some pieces in this article talking about the in-processing end of the Russian military, the tactics at the front, specifically around these Storm Z units, Russian leadership hiding losses, and then this soldier who goes by the name Anton, his escape. Quick note, Anton is likely not his real name, as this former soldier is now in Europe seeking political asylum. Now, Anton mentions that he initially joined the military and ended up in a Storm Z unit because he wanted to pay off a series of loans. He was promised that he'd be able to do so. Loans totaling around 1 million rubles is the whole reason that he decided to sign up and join in the first place. Before his eventual departure from Belgorod, where we'll go through that here at the end of the video, he did spend time for a couple months from October to November as part of a Storm Z unit in Kupiansk. Now, I'm going to pull up a map here to give you an idea of where we're talking about. We're not going to use the map very much in this video, but I think it's at least worth providing a little context as to where some of this fighting was taking place. So Kupiansk, up here in the northeastern portion of Ukraine, significant fighting for a lot of the war, and over the course of the period of time that Anton was there, October to November, there were quite a few offensives taking place in this area, and that's what Anton is going to describe here. Now, what I'm going to try to do when running through this article, as I do with most things, is try to provide this information in a way and break it down so that people without any military experience or knowledge of military matters have a better idea of what is normal, what isn't, and then what's completely off the charts crazy. And that's the same thing that the sponsor of today's video tries to do. Masterworks makes it easier to understand and invest in art. So I'm not an art expert, but that's kind of the point of using someone like Masterworks. You don't actually have to be. So this is a company that's been featured in Forbes, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and quite a bit more. The way they work is that they essentially do all of the legwork, all of the tough parts that take a long time for the average person here to learn, and kind of prevents us from ever being able to invest in something like art. Masterworks selects the artist, purchases the art, breaks it down into shares that you and I can then buy. They then hold the painting for it to appreciate over time, appreciate in value over time. Their clients, then, the way they earn any return on this is they hold those shares as they appreciate, and they can eventually sell those shares if they want, or the painting is eventually sold and you can cash out. So far, over $60 million in total proceeds has been distributed back to Masterworks investors across 23 separate exits. Masterworks offers contemporary and post-war art like Picasso and Banksy, with over 400 paintings so far offered to their more than 900,000 members to date. Check out the link in the description below or scan the QR code on your screen to learn more about Masterworks and to find out if investing in art is the right move for you and your family. Now, the article and the interview bounced around a little bit. I'm going to move through it in kind of the order of how everything played out, and that starts with the in-processing into the Russian military. And it's worth noting here, as we're going through all of this, Anton served in Storm Z. Storm Z is, to a degree, a penal unit, punishment unit, battalions across the Russian military. It was kind of the Russian Ministry of Defense's response to the Wagner use of prisoners. And they looked at that and said that, hey, that actually worked out pretty well. Maybe we should do something like that ourselves. And then you have Storm Z. So I should mention that we shouldn't take what Anton is saying here as indicative of what's happening across the entire Russian military. There are a lot more well-equipped, well-trained, well-resourced units across Russia. We're really kind of looking at, again, the penal type disposable soldiers that we've talked about before on this channel. So in looking at the in-processing, Anton says, quote, "Everything is fucked up there. They should have provided us with the basics, at least one set of clothes. Extortion started right away. 500 rubles here, 500 rubles there. We chipped in 2,000 or 3,000 for spare parts for the equipment. They made up some stupid story, like because our reserve battalion is stationed in Kaliningrad, there are problems with delivering spare parts here, so we have to chip in for them ourselves." This is in the category of like third world country military, right? The guys are showing up to their unit. The way we do this in the United States is you show up and you get everything. They give you everything that you need across the board, right? The idea that a soldier shows up and then is told, by the way, you need to spend money to get your equipment back up and working is surprising. Again, keep in context here, they're talking about the Storm Z units where the equipment is not always flowing in numbers, and he'll get to that here in a second. When looking at the clothing that he was issued, it's no different. He said among them was a repurposed Soviet helmet from the 1960s, a uniform 10 sizes too big, and combat boots 4 sizes too big. In the end, he bought the equipment, the necessary equipment, at his own expense. He said resellers came to the unit and sold everything they needed. So again, this is kind of a breakdown, if you will, of how a military should function when you're pulling people in and trying to equip them and send them out to training or directly into the fight, however it might be. The idea that they've got resellers showing up to try to turn a profit on these new recruits, and that the government isn't even able to provide like the baseline equipment that's necessary, the truck components, the vehicle components, they're having to buy off the private market, and then the clothing doesn't even fit. They have to buy that from somebody who shows up trying to take advantage of these soldiers who, they need boots that actually fit before they ship out to a war zone. Anton says of the 600 people in his unit, 40 survived after 2 months of assaults. He said, quote, I spent 2 months in that shithole near Kupiansk. It was just some kind of extermination. From one company, 5 to 6 people returned alive. They also fucked up all the equipment. By the end, they simply mixed us with the prisoners and just drove. How I survived is a good question. So again, kind of the overarching context we have to remind ourselves of here is this is the Storm Z unit. Disposable soldiers, disposable infantry that are designed to, in some cases, just draw fire from Ukrainian units. So it's, as shocking as those casualties are, they're talking about an entire company going out, or 600 people in his unit and 40 survived. Again, do not take that and apply that across the entire Russian military. Those are the casualty figures we should look at for some of these assault units, Storm Z units, penal type battalions. It's, near 100% casualties, which is absolutely shocking. Turning to the tactics of how these Storm Z units work, I thought this was really interesting. He said, first, the artillery processes the terrain, or kind of chews through enemy positions. Then the infantry storms the positions, followed by a fortification group, and then by evacuation and supply groups, which must carry out the wounded and dead and deliver ammunition, food, and water. But as a rule, they all mix up at the front, and the infantry often scatters on the approaches to the enemy positions. So at baseline, this is very similar to what you'd expect from a Western military, modern military. You have preparatory fires in some way, shape, or form, be it mortars, artillery, aircraft overhead, whatever it might be. So you have preparatory fires, then the assault of the position, your assault units, maneuver units, if you will, engineers coming up to fortify the position. Now, this is kind of hasty fortification. This isn't people coming up and digging new trenches. It might just be sandbags, mines, things like that to kind of set up a new defensive perimeter, if you will, at the forward location of troops. And then once that's complete, you take time to resupply the unit, bring up more ammunition, food, water, and start to evacuate some of the casualties. That order is pretty normal. That sounds about right. But what Anton talks about here is it kind of just all mixes together, and especially the infantry in the first wave, or they're just all over the place. So the planning is there, but again, as soon as they receive first enemy contact, it starts to kind of fall apart. He says, quote, the composition of the assault squads varies. It depends on how many people are added to the prisoners. On average, from 90 to 120 people. Sometimes they bring equipment. We go to storm a forest belt. In some places, there are dugouts and everything is prepared. In other places, everything is hastily. If you end up in the storm infantry, you are fucked. Which makes sense if you look at the casualty figures he mentioned earlier, right? 600 people in his unit, 40 survived. Those aren't good numbers ever in any war, right? So another piece here I want to dive in on a little bit is, and I think this gets misinterpreted at times in various reports, he says sometimes they bring equipment. And he goes into more depth on this in some other portions of the article where when he says equipment, what he's talking about is heavy equipment, right? So it might be automatic grenade launchers, might be vehicles in a sense, even heavier things like small mortars, maybe RPGs, recoilless rifles. He over and again talked about how they don't really trust the Storm Z units with that stuff. And the equipment in some senses is more valuable than the soldiers. So they'd rather just give the soldiers weapons that he said may or may not work some of the times. And they save that heavier equipment, machine guns and the like, for the traditional infantry, the Marines, the paratroopers, and others. So when he's talking about they may or may not bring equipment, it's not a matter of like no rifle. It's a matter of no heavy equipment, machine guns, mortars, grenade launchers, things like that. He says, according to Anton, he said many, after their first attempt, their first assault, refused to do that again and instead preferred to go to a place he called Zaitsevo, a village in Luhansk where military police hold refuseniks and guilty soldiers. So again, think about that. After one assault, these guys are like, yeah, this is not going to work out for me. They're opting to go to essentially military prison for people who are deserting. Saying that is the alternative. And it's not crazy to think that, right? If you're watching 50, 60, 70% of your unit get mowed down in one assault, and then they come back up and say, hey, we're going to do that again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, it kind of seems like common sense. To go, you know what? Is there another option where I can just like go to jail or something? That seems better. Can I go back to prison, maybe? That's, what's interesting here to me a little bit is part of the people making up these Storm Z units are the refuseniks. The ones who are refusing to fight in other areas, they get moved to Storm Z. So it's not entirely clear. I'd like more clarity on this, is if you refuse to fight in one area and you get moved to Storm Z and then you refuse to fight with Storm Z, do they really just move you to a prison? It seems like a step up. In fact, Anton talks about that. He says some of the guys like it. They're old barracks away from the front. Seems like life is kind of easy. So it's hard to connect those dots exactly how that plays out. Again, something we have to keep in mind when going through this or really any interview is this is one soldier's perspective, right? So we're not getting the broad brush of how everything plays out in Storm Z. This is Anton's perspective, a singular soldier that fought for a few months with this organization. He did kind of hammer on how the Russian authorities are trying to hide losses whenever possible, especially, again, within the Storm Z units. He said, quote, the authorities hide the losses in every way possible, recording their soldiers who did not return from the battlefield as 500ths. In war, 500ths are those who ran away or refused to take part in combat, so they deserted. He said if a person is missing for 2 or 3 weeks, then let's be realistic. He was most likely taken apart for spare parts or buried. But they're listed as 500ths. The command will get in trouble for the excessive expenditure of personnel, so they're listed as 500ths. So rather than saying after an assault, hey, 10 people were killed, 20, 30, 50, whatever it might be, some number of that they're listing as they ran away, they deserted. There's nothing we can do, which is, you got to think of the ramifications of that, right? It of course shows casualty figures are much lower than they actually are from some of these units, but then wonder how that plays out back home for the families. Is there any type of there's no pension paid if the person just deserted, if they never died, right? But if they're gone for 2 or 3 weeks after an offensive, where do they go? They're definitely captured or dead, most likely missing. It's hard to imagine that as many people as he's talking about are deserting somehow, not being captured by the Russian forces, and pushed back into service. So interesting piece there about how they're finding a way to kind of hide the losses at the front. And then getting into the actual escape that Anton carried out here, this all took place back in April where the Russian Volunteer Corps and some other units alongside them were pushing into Belgorod. So across the Ukrainian border into Belgorod, there's kind of chaos in and around that area, and it looks like Anton took advantage of that period of time to find his way out of Russia. Now, it sounds like he was a part of those events. He was moved to Belgorod eventually. When his unit was depleted down to just a couple dozen people remaining, they trained up the new recruits that came to the Kupiansk area. And you know what? Let's pull back a map here to show you kind of where he went from one location to another. So we've got Kupiansk here. New recruits came in, new Storm Z units came in. They trained them up for a period of time, and then he was relocated to Belgorod. Not a big jump, right? If you think about just moving a little bit of distance through Russian territory over here to somewhere in Belgorod where some of these attacks were taking across the border, which I think some of them were over in this area here. Yeah, Graveron. So they were moved to Belgorod and took up positions there. And in short order, the Russian Volunteer Corps, Freedom of Russia Legion, Siberian Legion, and I think a couple others pushed into Russian territory, and it was just chaos for a couple days. They've since moved back into Ukrainian territory. But as a part of that, Anton was fighting and was just not happy with how the whole thing was playing out and started to come across some YouTube channels about how he could escape and transition, or how he could escape and kind of surrender himself to Ukrainian forces or find a way out of this war. What he ended up doing, and he said, look, this whole process was actually pretty easy. If somebody wants to do it in the Russian military, it is not hard to desert and find your way out of Russia, which was interesting. I feel like we haven't heard that a whole lot. What Anton did was he said he got up, he requested leave one night, said rarely are they ever granted leave, especially the mobilized in 2022, and then any of these Storm Z guys, they're not given leave to go home, he says. He couldn't even get like a 2-day pass. He could get an overnight pass is what he was able to achieve. And he said that night he left camp, went to Belgorod, took his passport and other documents, rented a hotel, changed out his military uniform, put on a civilian one, just ditched the military uniform. From there, he went to Smolensk. Let's pull this map back up to give you an idea of Anton's travel here. So we've got Belgorod, the region he was in, kind of repelling and trying to push back the Russian Volunteer Corps. From there, he traveled north to northwest to Smolensk, Oblast here just west of Moscow. He traveled up here, train, taxi, something like that. Once in Smolensk, he rented an apartment and then took a taxi to Minsk the next day. So he took a taxi just straight across the border into Belarus. And he mentioned that at the entrance, the border crossing between Russia and Belarus, this is a soldier on active duty with Russia that's in the process of deserting. He said they didn't even check his documents. They just let him cross straight into Belarus. And then once he was in Minsk, he bought a plane ticket to Yerevan in Armenia. And from there, he traveled subsequently to another European country where he's now requesting asylum. He said that he believes he is entitled to asylum or has a chance at seeking political asylum because he refused to participate in war crimes during the war. We'll see. I haven't heard a lot of stories about soldiers like this deserting, finding their way to Europe, and then trying to seek political asylum. But this one was notable. The man definitely spent time in the Storm Z units. I think with any of these first-person accounts, you have to take it with a grain of salt. You know, again, it's a singular soldier's perspective. It's their point of view. They don't have any of the broader context, just like all of us in the same situation, right? But given some of the details he provided about the assault units, where they were attacking, how they were attacking, things like that, he certainly has that experience, and it's notable, trying to understand how a variety of these different units are working in Ukraine. That's all I got for now. Of course, if you're interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, which is linked in the description below. I'll put a couple articles down there that are related to the ongoing war in Ukraine. Should help to better understand the conflict as a whole. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.